Easily one of my favorite topics, nightmares, sleep paralysis. Today's video will have some crazy stories. A huge thank you to the writers, whose links can be found in the description, for allowing me to share their stories with all of you. Remember, you can send in your own stories to rylhstories@gmail.com. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to like and comment. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. I had a dream last night, except I think it's more than a dream. It was a dream within a dream, or better yet, a nightmare within a nightmare. I'm not sure if it meant anything, but it frightened me more than any other nightmare I'd ever experienced. Both seemed real, especially the second. I'll start from the beginning. I jolted awake. The crash of thunder set off some car alarms in the parking lot of my one-bedroom Minneapolis apartment. I rubbed my eyes and glanced at the clock, 5:47 a.m. I wandered out into the living room to make a pot of coffee and start my day. Lightning flashed. Within half a second, boom, I jumped. It was one hell of a storm. April showers. That's an understatement. It was my one day off between working 2 jobs and attending grad school full-time. But there was no way I would be able to get back to sleep. My heart was racing too much from the violent awakening. I turned on the coffee maker, then stopped cold. I was frozen in place with an overwhelming feeling of dread washing over me, like the rain from the storm. I could feel it trickle down my spine and drip from my shirt. Something was wrong. I felt imminent doom was upon me. I couldn't explain what triggered this feeling, and at first chalked it up to another anxiety attack. With my hectic schedule, I was having them more frequently, especially after last semester's brutal midterms. But this one was different. I could feel it wasn't an imaginary fear. It felt more concrete, as if the figurative demons, as my church friends sometimes call them, manifested into something dangerous and all too real, and they were closing in on me, their target. I broke from my trance, and without thinking, I found myself rushing to my bedroom. I locked the door and braced myself against it with all my strength. I heard a loud thrashing on the other side of the door. I'd never heard anyone come in. My complex was locked, as was my front door. With each burst from my pursuer, the door gave way, the hinges creaking. I could also feel the wood breaking from behind my hands. I knew it wouldn't hold for much longer. Panic-stricken, I started looking for an escape, my eyes fixed on the window overlooking the now drowning parking lot. I contemplated jumping the 3 stories to the hard concrete, anything to get away from whoever was trying to break in. My rational mind got the better of me. The fall alone would kill me. If I managed to survive, I would wind up with a broken leg. How would I run then, if he decided to come after me? I decided I would fight, stand my ground. It was my only chance. With one final crash, the door flew open, throwing me off balance. With my fists clenched and ready to start beating whoever came through the door and feet scrambling to catch my fall, I faced my assailant for the first time. I expected, at the worst, a large man, strong and maybe even slightly overweight. As I gazed in horror, I quickly realized that my expectation was wishful thinking. A man can be hurt, hindered, or even killed. But this... What came through that door, arms stretched out, appeared to be a woman, but it was a being much worse. Its skin was pale, or dead, and barely clinging to her frame. Scraggly blonde hair covered her face, but gave way as I attempted to push her away, revealing 2 furious eyes. Pupils gazed over with a gray film. Her mouth was full of decaying brown teeth. She lunged forward again and managed to close her hands around my throat. We fell to the floor. She straddled my helpless body, as I frantically attempt to pry her icy hands away. It was no use. Her grip was too powerful. Everything went silent. She went silent. I saw flashes of lightning, but heard no following thunder. I drifted out of consciousness and into my certain death. My last image was of those rage-filled eyes. Why? What did I do? And I jolted awake. The crash of thunder set off some car alarms in the parking lot of my one-bedroom Minneapolis apartment. I rubbed my eyes and glanced at the clock. 5:47 a.m. Only a dream, I thought as I stared at the ceiling. However, waking up in the exact same way, at the exact same time, left me a bit unnerved. It took some convincing to force myself out of bed and start my actual day. As I walked into the living room of my apartment, the room seemed brighter than in my dream, which comforted me. The rational part of my brain convinced me that the mind is capable of wonders beyond explaining. People experience déjà vu, have night terrors where they see someone in the room with them shortly before waking up, and even experience sleep paralysis, all of which are backed by one branch science or another. I poured myself some coffee and situated myself on my lumpy brown love seat. I was determined to get my statistics assignment finished by the end of the day. Rainy days were always perfect to hammer out some homework. I glanced at the sliding door leading to my balcony as the rain pounded against the wood floor and streaked the glass. As I took a sip from my coffee, I heard an urgent banging on the door. I jumped, spilling hot coffee down my chin and onto my shirt. I sat up and ran to the door, cutting through the kitchen to grab the towel hanging from the stove handle on the way. I peered through the peephole, but there was no one there. Confused, I opened the door and searched down both ends of the hallway. Again, no one was there. I listened for retreating footsteps, but the hall was silent. I shook my head. I must be going crazy. I closed the door, making sure to latch the deadbolt. You're letting your dream get the best of you. Who do you think that was? Do you think it was her? I shuddered. Images from my dream started to rush back to me, but I blocked them out. I refused to let my mind wander there, even if it was just a dream. I made my way back to the couch. As I stepped onto the carpet, a cold sensation on the sole of my foot sent shivers up my leg. There was a darkened wet spot on the carpet, almost like a footprint. The size was not much larger than my own foot. I scanned the rest of the carpet, only to see more wet spots, or footprints. Leading from the balcony through the living room, I could hear the blood rush through my ears with every increasing heartbeat. Someone is in my apartment. I'm not imagining that. I fumbled for my phone to call the cops. The battery was at 1%. It didn't charge last night. I was in tears at this point. Please God, no. The phone died as soon as I entered my passcode. A familiar sensation of paralysis overtook me. I could feel myself being sucked into the floor. The room grew larger and I began to feel faint. A panic attack was setting in. I felt helpless. I wanted to run, but that feeling of dread from my dream washed over me yet again. I needed to run. After a forced, deep breath, I moved quietly towards the door, with one hand on the deadbolt and the other on the handle. I prepared myself to run. I drew in another wavering breath and counted. 1, 2, 3. I thrust the door open and made a break for the stairwell. When I reached the bottom, I burst through the door, leading to the parking garage. Panic hit me again as I frantically felt my sweatshirt pockets for my car keys. They were there. Thank God. When I made it to my car, I immediately felt safer. I looked behind me and didn't see anyone. The only sound was that of my bare feet padding against the cement. I opened my car door, throwing myself into the driver's seat. I jammed the lock button twice to make sure I heard it click. I let out a sigh and forced myself to calm down. My hands were shaking. My whole body was shaking. And I was on the verge of hysterical tears. I just needed to drive, to get to a phone. I cleared my mind and decided to drive to the gas station up the street. I turned on the car and put it into reverse. As I glanced up into my rearview mirror, I was met with glassy gray eyes and a grin full of brown, rotted teeth. I felt her cold touch yet again, and on the back of my neck. She leaned in closer to me as if to whisper something in my ear. I awoke again before I could hear what it was that she wanted me to hear. This was earlier this morning. I'm afraid to go back to sleep. I'm afraid to see her again. I hope this is just an overly bizarre nightmare, and it ends here. But I fear it's something more. Sometimes I would have nightmares. Deep nightmares. The kind where you can't move. The kind where someone or something is creeping closer and closer to you, and you can't do anything to avoid it. 2 nights ago I had one of those dreams, but I didn't wake up. Or I wasn't sure if I had. But the thing from the dream, the thing that was creeping ever closer to me, it was still following me. I'd been able to see every now and again, in the light coming in from underneath the door, I could see whatever it was obscuring the light. In the backseat of my car, I could feel it laying down out of sight from my rearview mirror, and I was too scared to turn around and look at it. I wasn't sure what to do. The following night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I decided to do some research on sleep paralysis. People always talk about it. The feeling of being restricted as something comes up to your body, or holds you down, maybe breathes on you. But I couldn't find anything about these creatures following you into your waking life. I called a friend of mine, Alex. She was very into the paranormal, but in a sort of rudimentary way. She wasn't an expert, but I figured she might have an idea of what was happening to me. At the least, she wouldn't think I was insane, and would listen to what I had to say. I called her, and just after she said hello, I started unloading. I hadn't realized how much I had been holding in, but she listened, chiming in occasionally with a grunt of agreement. I had just started to feel a bit more relaxed, until she started to speak, and the same familiar pit of dread quickly returned. Her voice was malfunctioning. At first it sounded like feedback, then became a constant, deeper voice, first overlapping hers, then repeating every word, until the voice became solely that of a garbled, deep tone. I was silent on the other end of the line. She kept saying, "Get more sleep." Then she kept repeating the word mare. I hung up. I would continue to avoid people for the remainder of the day. I was beginning to get worried, thinking that perhaps I had finally lost my mind. But I was still here. In my mind, I felt safe. It was the outside world that worried me. I couldn't sleep or it would get me. I couldn't walk outside or it would find me. I couldn't even talk to people, because I knew it would be fooling me, tricking me as it did with Alex. Mare, mare, mare. I searched the web for it, and it was the first thing that appeared. A night hag, referred to as mare in Old English. I searched more, found similar stories. Night hags riding people, amateur witches saying to leave mustard seeds under my front door, to bless a knife and keep it near me, to cover myself in pepper before I go to bed. But nothing about the demon following you from sleep. Paranoia, maybe, but nothing as concrete as seeing it lurking within the shadows of your home, hearing its voice, speaking directly to you. But against my doubts, I had decided to try what the witch forum had told me. I didn't have mustard seeds in my home, but I wasn't prepared to leave my house and go to the store. But I had pepper, and I had a knife. So I followed the basic outline of how to perform a blessing. Then I took to my bed, laid down on my back, and shut my eyes. I was far from being tired, but I tried my best to let my body relax. I was tense, fearful of whatever might come through the door. I waited and waited, waited for what felt like hours. And then all at once, everything went black. I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't awake. I was lying in what felt like my bed, still clutching the knife I had blessed. The darkness was so deep that I couldn't tell whether or not my eyes were open. I heard the familiar click of my door handle, so I was still in my room. Maybe I was sleeping. I couldn't make sense of the situation, but attempting to use logic at this point seemed foolish. The door moaned as it opened, slow and then stopped, and all sound around me seemed to vanish as well, plunging the room into an even deeper state of stillness. It was here. I could feel it. Mare. I felt just as I had on the phone, in my room, in my car, back on the first nights I had encountered it. I knew that it was here with me, or that I was there, in its realm with it. My grip on the knife grew more firm, and in that instant I had realized that I was still able to move. The void of silence was interrupted by a steady breathing coming from the foot of the bed, in and out, slowly picking up speed until it became a steady pant. Famished, parched, I could imagine the foam at its mouth. I knew I wasn't fooling it. I knew it was aware that I wasn't sleeping. And this was all confirmed when the panting stopped, and it spoke to me, spitting up a single command: sleep. I said nothing in reply. I felt hands slowly grip around my ankles. They were cold, wet, leathery palms, their grip slowly growing intense. I wanted to scream. I wanted to move, but that grip alone stunned me into submission. I was paralyzed. My grip on the knife stayed strong. I couldn't release it even if I wanted to. The demon's grip started to make its way up my legs. Its panting resumed. I could feel its breath on my legs, creeping up and up, higher until it reached my chest, where it suddenly came to a halt. At first, I didn't understand what was happening. The demon had begun coughing, wheezing, spitting, and hacking. I felt its hands release me. Then I remembered, all in an instant, the pepper. It had worked. The room was still a black void. I could see nothing, but my motor functions returned, its grip no longer paralyzing me. I stood, listening for the wheezing, trying to pinpoint its exact location. I knew my room well. I could visualize exactly where it stood coughing, and before I could think, I shot towards it, knife first, sinking the blade into its flesh so forcefully that I soon felt my entire hand engulfed in its cold flesh. It screamed, loud, shrill, and what sounded like it was being directed right towards my face. I could still see nothing but darkness, but I felt its spit raining on my face, its putrid breath. I only drove the knife deeper, more from fear than might. The volume of its shriek was deafening, and it only grew louder. So loud that the darkness in my room seemed to almost crack, to split, and in an instant, it became light. I was lying on the floor of my bedroom. My knife sat just ahead of me, framed in a blade of sunlight that cut through my room. Seeing that light, I had realized that even though I had been awake for what felt like 2 days, I hadn't really remembered seeing the sun. I called Alex a bit later, after I managed to gather myself back to a semblance of sanity, trying to recall what exactly had just occurred. She said that I had called, but the call outed just after I had said hello, and that she couldn't reach me again. I asked her if I could come over. She obliged, and I told her all of it. And she listened, to every detail, told me to write it down, as if I would forget it. To be honest, I'm still suffering from the paranoia that I'm not fully awake even now. But I obliged, and here it is. Maybe it can help you. Hopefully you won't need it. Within the past few years, it's become a fairly common occurrence for me to get sleep paralysis. It started pretty much as soon as I moved out of my parents' house, and moved in with my then boyfriend, who's now my husband, Jacob. The first night it happened, I woke to Jacob shaking me awake, telling me that I had been mumbling and crying with my eyes open, staring in the corner of the room. I told him that I had seen a man standing over there, wielding a knife and threatening to kill both Jacob and I, which, needless to say, terrified the both of us. The next day we purchased security cameras, and soon found out that whenever I was seeing a man in the room, there was never actually anyone there. Endless internet searches led me to find that what I was experiencing was sleep paralysis. Unfortunately for me, I could never figure out what was triggering these episodes of sleep paralysis, so I was never able to make them stop. They became a regular occurrence, about once a week, so I was forced to continue to suffer from these freakish nightmares. The worst part about my experiences with sleep paralysis was the first few times that the man came over to me and used the knife to slit my throat open. When I could finally wake myself up, I would be screaming and crying in pain. I felt like I was suffocating as the cool, serrated edges of the blade tore into my trachea, and only when Jacob woke me up would I be able to breathe again. Well, the pain magically vanished. Of course, the weekly sleep paralysis and the lack of sleep it caused both Jacob and I started to take a toll on our marriage. We began arguing a lot, and some nights Jacob wouldn't even bother to wake me up from my sleep paralysis state because he didn't feel like it. Eventually, we started going to couples therapy, where things began to ever so slightly improve, and that just about catches us up to the other nights. A few nights ago, the nightmares took a much different turn. I opened my eyes to find myself paralyzed with fear as a man stood over my bed. His face was covered by a Halloween mask that I vaguely recognized, which was new. Seeing as I was never able to look the being in the eyes before, I screamed as loud as I could manage, and the sound echoed off the walls. I froze, realizing that normally I couldn't make any sort of noise, other than mumbling unintelligibly. Instead of using a knife to cut my throat open, he wrapped both of his hands around my neck and began to squeeze, completely blocking my airway. I attempted to gasp for air and silently willed Jacob to try and wake me up, because the feeling of suffocating was truly horrific to experience. However, he never did. When I opened my eyes a few seconds later, or so I thought, I noticed I was in a hospital room. Confused, I tried to ask the doctor in the room what was going on, but I found myself unable to utter a single word. I guess he noticed my failed attempts at speaking, because he turned to face me and took a seat next to me. I guess you're wondering what's going on. He sighed. I'm Dr. Carson, and you're in the emergency room because of what happened last night. A neighbor heard your screams and called 911 before coming to make sure you were alright. He found you being suffocated by a man in a clown mask. Do you remember any of that? I nodded my head in response, while looking at him to continue. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but the man got away. Your neighbor gave a fairly good description of the man, and what he was wearing, so police are still on the lookout, and will keep a close surveillance on you until the man is found. Oh, and one more thing. We tried to get in touch with your husband, but he hasn't been answering phone calls. Are you aware of where he is at the moment? Suddenly I was able to piece together where I recognized that clown mask from. Jacob had worn it as part of a Halloween costume a few years prior. My brain has always been a bit different. I've known that ever since I was a young child. When I was a teenager and became overwhelmed by it, I eventually felt brave enough to open up to my mom and tell her that I didn't feel right, that something was wrong with me. Her response? I bought you some daily vitamins. That should help. I smiled and learned to bottle up my emotions within the confines of those cheap supplements. And over the following years, I needed a bottle so deep that it could bury me whole. I had my first mental breakdown in my mid-20s. Looking back, I'm honestly surprised that it took that long. But I guess being married to an abusive meth addict for several years was the straw that broke the camel's back. That poor camel was paralyzed, and had to be taken out back and put out of its misery at that point. Anyway, I was diagnosed with manic depression, which was no surprise to me. My mother still denies my diagnosis to this day, as she lives in a dream world where mental illness isn't real, and we all need our hugs and positive thinking, and Flintstone vitamins. If only it were that easy, Mom. I wish it were. I really do. I had a pretty good hold on my manic depression for years up until recently. I'll spare the details, but life decided to rip me apart again like a massive tornado, and the chemicals in my brain have been screaming at me in protest. My poor brain has been short-circuiting and overheating, as I've been burying it all and pretending that I'm fine, but I can't deny it anymore. I had my first nightmare in over 10 years, and it was so intense that I'm fairly certain it overloaded my brain and almost killed me. The dream started out relatively normal as it could be, if you routinely take road trips with your worst enemy. Jess was my living nightmare many years ago, so it's actually rather fitting that she would have a starring role in all of this. She was the woman that had an affair with my husband, the woman that stalked him for months and harassed me endlessly after he and I decided to work through it. My husband's guilt drove him to bury his sorrows in the depths of a needle that would poison him from his veins all the way down to his soul. I had never dreamt of Jess before. Hell, I hadn't even thought of her since the divorce a few years ago. But here she was, the driver of the hearse to my funeral. She was driving and I was fixing my lipstick in the visor in the passenger seat. I couldn't see my face in the mirror, only my mouth. She asked if I was still on speaking terms with them, and I watched my lips from every single word of my response. I was even looking at my crooked bottom tooth like I do in real life, if I'm ever talking while looking at a mirror. I was wearing my hot pink lipstick, a shade I rarely wore in real life. It was truthfully a lipstick I only wore when I was taking selfies, and pretending that I was fun and carefree, or some other pretentious crap. I was trying to wipe it off when I responded with, "No, we don't talk because the last time we tried, he told me he wanted to get back together, and when I told him that wasn't an option, he spiraled and had to be admitted to the mental hospital." That part about him was true. That's why it didn't feel like a dream. I had also worn lipstick a few nights before. I remember actually thinking about my answer before I said it, and thinking about how much I honestly hated that lipstick. I don't remember ever thinking about things in my dreams before. It was all so real. More realistic than any dream I'd ever had before. And then all of a sudden nothing made any sense, and my brain didn't know how to cope. After I said that I couldn't speak to him anymore, I put the visor up and suddenly it was nighttime, and I was in the driver's seat. Everything felt different. I knew immediately that something was wrong. It was in that instant that it turned into a nightmare. I couldn't see anything out of the windshield, and I was so scared and confused. Jess starts trying to help me drive, saying, "Turn the wheel to the right. What are you doing? You're swerving into the other lane." And I remember thinking, I shouldn't be driving. Why am I driving? I start to panic and take my hands off the wheel, and she shouts, "Watch out for that car." We spun around in circles until we came to a complete stop. I see police lights and I turn to look at her for the first time. In a panicked voice she said, "You need to run." Then she disappeared. I open the door and stagger out of the car. I see 3 policemen, 2 men and a woman. I shielded my eyes as I got out because my vision was still not working properly. But as soon as I looked at the police, I felt completely coherent again. I felt safe. The officer with the mustache asked, "Ma'am, have you been drinking tonight?" And I told him that I had a couple of shots and a few beers, but that was several hours ago. I explained that I wasn't drunk, so I don't know how I lost control of the car like that. And it was true. That's exactly what I had to drink that night, and I wasn't drunk when I went to sleep. My vision starts going strange again, and the lady cop asks what's wrong. I say, I think I'm having a breakdown or something. Like I'm losing touch with reality. This doesn't feel right. Suddenly I feel these sunglasses cover my eyes, and I can't see anything. I hear the clean-shaven officer say, "You're going to have flute auditions at every red light you stop at in traffic." And I shout, "No, I'm not. That doesn't even make any sense. What's going on?" Then I start shouting for help, but help doesn't come. I'm screaming into the darkness as I feel the sunglasses pressing hard against my eyes. And I'm screaming, "Help me! Why aren't any of you helping me?" I claw at my eyes for several minutes. Well, it feels like my eyeballs are about to explode out of their sockets from the agony. And I finally rip them off. I'm suddenly coherent again, standing completely alone on the side of the road by the abandoned car that I had crashed. I see the woman officer and the guy officer with the mustache pull up on motorcycles, with sidecars attached to them. I walk over to them and ask, "Seriously, what's going on? Am I being arrested? I'm really confused." The man tells me that I'm not under arrest. They're there to take me home. He then asks, "Is it possible that the girl you were with drugged you?" And I replied, "It's possible. I think I remember drinking some water she offered me a few hours ago, but my perception of time is really messed up right now." The woman officer tells me to gather my things from the car and put them in her sidecar. I pick up a few things and drop them in, and we're all chuckling over how it's been a really strange night. I go back to pick up the last of my things, and when I lean down to pick up my pack of cigarettes, I get jerked into the air by my back belt loop. It's like a fisherman hooked the back of my pants and was slowly reeling me in, and I panicked as I was dragged across the ground for a few feet. I see the officers chatting with each other across the road, and I try to shout to them, but I can't make a sound. I'm trying so hard to scream, but it comes out in pitiful whispers. As I start slowly floating up into the air, I panic, and start waving my arms frantically until the male officer sees me. He shouts, "What's going on?" And the female cop looks back and screams as I'm jerked 50 feet in the air surrounded by this bluish neon light. I'm trying to scream so hard that my body feels like it's on fire, and I see them jump off their motorcycles and run towards me shouting and drawing their guns. But then I'm flipped over on my back and swallowed by lights, engulfed by the most bizarre and beautiful colors that my waking eyes have never actually seen. That's the story of how I kept realizing I was in a dream, but my brain kept going into overload and resetting me back into the dream. I honestly think that if I wasn't able to wake myself up when I did, I would have had a brain aneurysm and died from the sheer intensity of it all. I woke up screaming and drenched in sweat. I could feel the rawness in my throat of the many attempted screams in my nightmare. My body felt strange for several hours afterward, and when I drifted to the fridge and chugged a half-gallon of water, I felt like I was still dreaming. I honestly contemplated if I was even still alive. I was so freaked out that I had to turn off the lights in my bedroom and write down what I remembered. I was scared to go back to sleep, because I wasn't sure if I would wake up again, or be swallowed by the hauntingly beautiful lights in the sky once and for all.